This episode of the Moscow Report is brought to you from Russia's second city, the beautiful capital of the north, St. Petersburg. Gaudy streets and elegant monuments, a living museum in homage to the grandeur of 18th and 19th century architecture, a Venice of the North for those who don't mind the cold. Russia's capital of culture is one of the great European cities. And on the outskirts, in a nod to Russia's vast resource wealth, the soaring majesty of Europe's tallest building, Laktia Tower, the headquarters of Russia's energy giant, Gazprom. The reason I've come to St. Petersburg is to meet the former Austrian Foreign Minister, Karin Kneissl. She's a woman I've wanted to meet for some time. Not only is she one of the world's foremost energy experts, the story of how she ended up living and working in St. Petersburg is symptomatic of one of the greatest tragedies befalling Europe today. Whilst in government, she was famously pictured dancing with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and the European press went into hysterics. Authorities tried to ruin her life because she promoted a European energy policy that utilized Russia's cheap resources. And so she became unemployable and feared for her safety. And so she felt she had no choice but to leave to Russia, where she now heads the renowned Gorky Institute at St. Petersburg University. Ms. Kneissl is one of a host of British and European academics, journalists, and private individuals whom the authorities have tried to ruin because they promoted good relations between Russia and Europe. And the attempted destruction of their lives keeps many more silent. Much of the rest of the world stands in bewilderment of European energy policy, how they would forsake Russia's vast energy wealth in favor of war. Still, for those forsaken by Europe, there are worse places than the majesty of St. Petersburg to live out your days in exile. Dr. Kneissl, thank you for joining me. Is there an energy crisis in Europe right now? How did that happen, and what are the solutions?
Well, the energy crisis in terms of price hikes started in 2021. So it's not Putin's energy war, as they like to say. It's not Putin's inflation. It's not the weaponization of gas and oil by Russia. We saw, for various reasons, these price hikes. Reason number one was that we had underinvestment for many years. That was due to the uncertainty in demand. So oil-producing countries, big companies, whether they were national or international oil companies, had a hard time in finding enough funds to open up new fields of oil and gas. And add to that the various green deals that we had in terms of we have to move out of fossil fuels. Shareholders in big companies like BP were not ready to invest more in fossil projects. So it was all about underinvestment. And this underinvestment led to a shortage of energy also. That's with oil and gas. Another story was electricity, European electricity market, which is a very complex, strange topic. But the crisis, if you look at it in terms of price hikes, it really started in 2021. I remember very well writing about it on a regular level. And in 2022, there were some price jumps in the beginning because of the moving out of EU countries of buying first Russian coal, then Russian gas and Russian oil. Now they want to phase out of everything by the end of 2026. In contrast to what some people said, they will have a shortage. It's not so much the shortage, it's the price hikes. And from an affordable energy, we have moved to a nearly unaffordable energy supply. And this is a big burden to households and to companies, of course. But already long before that, to give you an example, in what was going on between France and Germany, both EU countries, neighboring countries, but in France, you paid as a company exactly half the price per one production unit when it comes to energy. So half the price of electricity, half the price of heating, etc., which is due to the fact that in France, 80% of electricity is still produced by nuclear power stations. They will have their own problems, and it's not such a good picture also in France when it comes to security in supply. In many EU countries, notably in Germany, Austria, you had a climate policy for decades, in which energy was an annex. I always said climate is important, but you need an energy policy, and climate has to be part of the whole thing, but you need to invest. You need to provide the market with some sort of predictability. Now, the pipelines going from Russia to Central Europe were built on long-term gas contracts, and that enabled companies to plan ahead. Of course, the price was not totally fixed. It always depended on the contract in which way it would move, but it didn't oblige officials or companies to look for gas every day. You know, like you buy your oil vessel, you buy your electricity units. No, you had this security in supply. Now, with moving out of these long-term contracts, which happened already over the last 2 years, European officials, companies have to look across the globe. And they are not the only ones who look for the LNG vessel coming from Qatar or coming from Mozambique, wherever they want to buy now. There are other competitors who are quicker and who are also ready to pay more. Europe is not such a courted market anymore. And even let's assume in some years from now there will be again some sort of normalization, I claim, maybe I'm totally mistaken, but it's my logic that tells me that Europe will not be such an interesting market for a Russian gas supplier or oil supplier, because after deindustrialization, which is in full swing, there will not anymore be the same demand. So to answer your question in one word, yes, there's an energy crisis, self-imposed, by bureaucracy, red tape, by mismanagement, and by the absence of something that you could call a genuine energy policy.
And just how damaging has European policy towards Russia been to the European economy and to energy policy, particularly in regards to its continued support of the prolonging of the conflict in Ukraine?
I think it's all homemade. You know, it's not that I would consider Russia as the reason, as the causa behind all that. The Europeans are committing collective suicide. I'm not the only one who claims that. They're shooting themselves not into one knee, not into two knees. It's right the bullet into the lung. And this maybe has to do also with this romantic German tradition of love for the apocalypse. You know, it's nothing new. Romanticism is a typical German cultural tradition. You don't find it in Sicily. You also don't find it to the same extent, I think, in Ireland. It's something purely German. And this is somehow history repeating itself. And Russia is the threat. They write it down, you know, it's not only a rumor, they write it down in a coalition pact of the new German government. The biggest threat is Russia. And there's an old antagonism that comes up. It's like 2,500 years ago, Greek city-states fighting a war of freedom against the Persian Empire. And this old picture comes back again and again. So here is poor little Europe, market economies, democracies, and there is the large authoritarian empire. 2,500 years ago it was the Persians, then it was the Arabs, then the Ottomans, then the Soviet Union, but during Soviet Union everything was not as harsh as it is right now, because no cultural contacts, no human contacts to a large extent. So I think that it's homemade. It's something the Europeans apparently want to continue.
Can Europe do without Russian energy?
Yes, you can, but it's a matter of price. You can buy LNG across the globe, but it costs you a lot of money. And the thing is that Russian energy doesn't have a label. You know, the Russian gas that goes via Turkstream into a Turkish hub is then bought by the Europeans. So there it is blended with maybe gas coming from Egypt or gas coming from some Eastern Mediterranean field. There are also gas reserves there. So it's blended, and you don't anymore, is it Russian, is it what? I mean, it doesn't have a national etiquette. We are also in a gas market, in a global market, like in the oil market, and it's gas that European clients have to buy at a higher price. But they are now outphasing of everything. So by the end of 2026, they can say, wonderful, we did it. We are not anymore buying a single drop of Russian LNG, what they are still buying a lot. We don't buy Russian uranium. We don't buy Russian rare earth metals, etc. Nothing, zero. But there's a global market. Of course, globalization is fragmented. Globalization is not the globalization of the 1990s. But it's a fragmented world, but still we are in a global market and we are in commodity trading. You will buy copper from Brazil or elsewhere on a certain trading platform, and you don't exactly know where it comes from. And maybe you're also not at all interested in where it comes from.
Many people would agree with you. Many people have been fighting for this very thing, that to end the conflict in Ukraine, and saying just what you said, that it seems to be economic suicide on behalf of Europe, largely provoking a conflict with Russia and prolonging it. You spent most of your life in Europe, in politics and academia.
Yeah.
What do you think's behind it? A lot of people can't understand can't understand Europe's policy towards Russia. What do you think's behind it ultimately?
It's something deeply rooted. I don't buy the argument that it's just the Western elites or so. I always ask myself, who are these Western elites? I don't know them. I never met them. Because today it's a lot about PR agencies, it's communication experts and so on, and politicians are made by a PR group plus a party. So there are no independent thinking elites who meet whatever. Certain people suspect certain things, I don't share it. I see more a historic pattern that is there. And if I may speak briefly about the country I know best, which happens to be Austria. Austria used to be the Catholic power. It's a little bit like Spain, but in a different way. And the Habsburgs were the biggest enemies, so to say, natural enemies of the Romanovs, because it was also about the monopoly of truth. Who has, today we speak about values, but also in those days, you had the monopoly of power defined by the Habsburgs, the Catholic power, and they saw themselves in the tradition of the Roman Empire. On the other hand, you had a Grand Duke of Moscow who said one day, I am calling myself Tsar, which was a challenge to the established system of the Kaiser. And plus, later on, they were fighting for influence in the Balkans. Also, again, Orthodoxy versus the Latins, the Catholics, and that affected then a lot, of course, the build-up of World War I. And the slogans that you would read in today's German Austrian papers, it's one-to-one of what you read in 1914. It's a deeply rooted hatred against Russia. And so it's more than what some people claim, the current elites, and it's more than the Ukraine question, the Crimea question. Speaking on Ukraine, I read over the last 3 years lots of books because I had no clue about Russia. I had some idea, but definitely not the same knowledge, insight I had about Lebanon or Syria or Iran, which I happen to know much better than Russia. And so I read. And in one of those books, I came across certain historical facts that I was not aware of, namely to what extent the return of Lenin and the rise of the Bolsheviks was financed by Vienna and Berlin. I always thought this was like a last-minute decision in 1917 to calm down the Eastern Front. No, it was prepared a long time in advance. There was Mr. Helphand, who was like the mastermind, financing a lot of movements, inter alia also Turkish nationalists, and he organized all that. So there was a saying in Vienna, and it's true for today, people forgot it: you cannot destroy Russia on the battlefield, but you can destroy it from inside. And this sabotage, this regime change wishes. Sergei Narishkin, the head of the internal security system, said a few days ago that they have many facts that point to to the scenario of such sabotage once again, you know, whether it's London, and they have already said very loudly that of course they will support Ukrainians even after a settlement. So you are negotiating for something, but you carry the risk along that there might be some groupuscule who act on whosever account and continue what they are trying to do now. So all this is unfortunately nothing new under the sun. It's somehow part of Russian thriller history, because the history of this country reads like a thriller. And I see there's a certain continuation.
Well, let me ask you about Iran, because you know Iran better than you do Russia. There's developing opportunities between the two countries. Obviously, the countries have always had for a long time, had a kind of almost uneasy friendship, but that friendship is growing, certainly, particularly in the energy field. What opportunities do you think there are between Russia and Iran in the energy field?
Well, it's above all the North-South corridor. It's connecting St. Petersburg with India via Iran, via the Caspian. Very ambitious, very interesting project, but it needs still a lot of work to really put it and make it work and go beyond the idea of very nice and ambitious ideas. You said that it's now growing. Yes, but let us also not forget that the Iranians are also very much conscious of history. And what was the great game in 19th century, and which put Tsarist Russia and the British Empire at loggerheads, was all about Persian territory, which the then Qajar dynasty was losing. They were weak, they were military not very fit. And the Russian armed forces in those days managed to conquer the Caucasus inter alia, which was dominated by the Qajar Persian emperors. And by the way, Iran adopted its name of Iran not after the 1979 revolution or something. It was in the 1930s, and it was maybe an idea from Goebbels. There are no really well-founded correspondences. I've always been looking for one. But Iran is the older name of the country, and Persia is actually the province around Shiraz, which is more a Greek origin. And but Iran was always a multicultural empire. There were Armenians, there were Azeris, there were Arabs, and there were the Persians as one ethnic group. But Iran, so to say, encompasses all of that. And both the Tsarist Empire and the Persian Empire always saw themselves as competitors, as neighbors and competitors. And when it comes to energy, in the year 2002, there was an initiative by a number of German and Austrian energy companies trying to build up a project called Nabucco. It was all about getting rid of Russian gas, and instead of buying Russian gas, buying, for instance, Iranian gas. And the European Commission was one of the lead actors in all that, because they said, yes, very good idea. We don't want to be more dependent on Russia. Joschka Fischer, by the way, former German Minister of Foreign Affairs, was, so to say, the main lobbyist for Nabucco. And I was back then often in Iran discussing Nabucco, and my Iranian counterparts, officials, non-officials, often told me, yes, we would love to do business with the European Union, but it never worked. I mentioned that, but it never worked. It was different reasons, because it was mismanagement by this consortium. They never got a real supply contract. They went to Turkmenistan, it was a strange story. I wrote about it a lot. But what I think what one should be aware of is that they are all competitors. The Iranians, Azerbaijan, Russia, they are all competitors. And when the Europeans were looking for gas beyond Russia, one of the trips was to Azerbaijan. It was to Qatar. It was to different others. So I think one should not approach it too much under the general title of friendship. One should understand the whole thing in the larger context of interests, competing interests. History is a burden and certainly not a support in that case, I would say. So I think that where cooperation is right now underway is this trade corridor, north-south. There is a desire to handle certain geopolitical situations which the Iranians have been in for years, and the Russians, so to say, went into as of 2022, and which was of huge interest for the Russian side. How did you manage? You know? So this is something where the Russians also wanted to learn from the Iranians, and the Iranians were able to build up a tremendous military power under sanctions. What makes Iran differ so much from other countries, states in the region, is that they work with Iranians, with Iranian expertise, knowledge. They didn't outsource anything. They never had any Westerner doing anything. Of course, you had energy companies like BP, Shell. They were there until 2005-06 when the huge sanctions started. But otherwise, they made it themselves. And they were betrayed several times by promises. The Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, what everybody calls the Iran deal. It's not a deal, it's an agreement, several hundreds of pages. Trump wanted to put it on 2 pages. I think you need more pages. This was put out of operation. And the Iranians, there were several negotiators who really risked a lot to get where they got in 2015. Then in 2018, an anyway empty shell, because there were never any investments, there were only promises, was buried. Now we have again these talks, and these talks are nevertheless, I think, also in the light of certain companies which wish to get back to the Iranian market in order to be also less dependent on the Russian market. You know, it's competition.
Can Europe do without Iranian energy, or would it benefit from Iranian energy?
Yes, they would love. I'm pretty sure. And you know what is happening between Europe and Russia never ever happened with Iran. Even when there were UN Security Council sanctions, so I may say true sanctions, because these unilateral sanctions are a breach of international law. But when we had United Nations Security Council sanctions supported by Russia, never ever were Iranian officials not allowed to attend a diplomatic reception. Never ever was there a breakdown of all cultural and academic contacts. When I traveled to Iran, people looked at me and said, "How is it?" I said, "It's interesting." "How did you get there?" I said, "With a visa." It was tough work, and it required trust. And but the thing is that this hatred was never there as we have it now with Russia. Even so, I would say the actions by certain Iranians also on European territory were not too friendly, which has never happened from the Russian side. So this desire to circumvent Russia and buy energy from Iran has been around for a while. And also you cannot imagine BP as such. BP was all about Persian concessions, Anglo-Iranian concessions later on. And by the way, BP had concessions on the territory of Iran until the year 1999 for the whole territory. So a lot of things happened in between. We had Mossadegh in the 1950s. We had the Islamic Revolution in 1979. But I am pretty sure that several Western companies would be ready to go for Iran and say this is an alternative to Russia.